This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nocturna. Moll Flanders by Daniel Defoe. Section 4. But things did not end here. But things did not end here. I went back to town, did the business he publicly directed me to, and was at home before anybody thought me long. As for my gentleman, he stayed out, as he told me he would, till late at night, and there was not the least suspicion in the family either on his account or on mine. We had, after this, frequent opportunities to repeat our crime, chiefly by his contrivance, especially at home, when his mother and the young ladies went abroad a-visiting, which he watched so narrowly as never to miss, knowing always beforehand when they went out, and then failed not to catch me all alone, and securely enough, so that we took our fill of our wicked pleasure for near half a year, and yet, which was the most to my satisfaction, I was not with child. But before this half year was expired, his younger brother, of whom I have made some mention in the beginning of the story, falls to work with me, and he, finding me alone in the garden one evening, begins a story of the same kind to me, made good honest professions of being in love with me, and, in short, proposes fairly and honourably to marry me, and that before he made any other offer to me at all. I was now confounded, and driven to such an extremity as the like was never known, at least not to me. I resisted the proposal with obstinacy, and now I began to arm myself with arguments. I laid before him the inequality of the match, the treatment I should meet with in the family, the ingratitude it would be to his good father and mother, who had taken me into their house upon such generous principles, and when I was in such a low condition, and, in short, I said everything to dissuade him from his design that I could imagine, except telling him the truth, which would indeed have put an end to it all, but that I durst not think of mentioning. But here happened a circumstance that I did not expect indeed, which put me to my shifts, for this young gentleman, as he was plain and honest, so he pretended to nothing with me but what was so too, and knowing his own innocence, he was not so careful to make his having a kindness for Mrs. Betty a secret the house, as his brother was. And though he did not let them know that he had talked to me about it, yet he said enough to let his sisters perceive he loved me, and his mother saw it too, which, though they took no notice of it to me, yet they did to him, and immediately I found their carriage to me altered more than ever before. I saw the cloud, though I did not foresee the storm. It was easy, I say, to see that their carriage to me was altered, and that it grew worse and worse every day, till at last I got information among the servants that I should, in a very little while, be desired to remove. I was not alarmed at the news, having a full satisfaction that I should be otherwise provided for, and especially considering that I had reason every day to expect I should be with child, and that then I should be obliged to remove without any pretences for it. After some time, the younger gentleman took an opportunity to tell me that the kindness he had for me had got vent in the family. He did not charge me with it, he said, for he knew well enough which way it came out. He told me his plain way of talking had been the occasion of it, for that he did not make his respect for me so much a secret as he might have done, and the reason was that he was at a point that if I would consent to have him, he would tell them all openly that he loved me, and that he intended to marry me, that it was true his father and mother might resent it, and be unkind, but that he was now in a way to live, being bred to the law, and did not fear maintaining me agreeable to what I should expect; and that, in short, he believed I would not be ashamed of him, so he was resolved not to be ashamed of me; and that he scorned to be afraid to own me now, whom he resolved to own after I was his wife, and therefore I had nothing to do but to give him my hand, and he would answer for all the rest. I was now in a dreadful condition indeed, and now I repented heartily in my easiness with the eldest brother, not from any reflection of conscience, but from a view of the happiness I might have enjoyed, and had now made impossible. For though I had no great scruples of conscience, as I have said, to struggle with, yet I could not think of being a whore to one brother and a wife to the other. But then it came into my thoughts that the first brother had promised to make me his wife when he came to the estate. But I presently remembered what I had often thought of, that he had never spoken a word of having me for a wife after he had conquered me for a mistress. And indeed, till now, though I said I had thought of it often, yet it gave me no disturbance at all, for as he did not seem in the least to lessen his affection to me, so neither did he lessen his bounty, though he had the discretion himself to desire me not to lay out a penny of what he gave me in clothes, or to make the least show extraordinary, because it would necessarily give jealousy in the family, since everybody knew I could come at such things no manner of ordinary way, but by some private friendship, which they would presently have suspected. But I was now in a great strait, and knew not what to do. The main difficulty was this: the younger brother not only laid close siege to me, but suffered it to be seen. He would come into his sister's room and his mother's room, and sit down, and talk 1,000 kind things of me, and to me, even before their faces, and when they were all there. This grew so public that the whole house talked of it, and his mother reproved him for it, and their carriage to me appeared quite altered. In short, his mother had let fall some speeches, as if she intended to put me out of the family, that is, in English, to turn me out of doors. Now I was sure this could not be a secret to his brother, only that he might not think, as indeed nobody else yet did, that the youngest brother had made any proposal to me about it. But as I easily could see that it would go farther, so I saw likewise there was an absolute necessity to speak of it to him, or that he would speak of it to me. And which to do first I knew not, that is, whether I should break it to him, or let it alone, till he should break it to me. Upon serious consideration, for indeed now I began to consider things very seriously, and never till now, I say, upon serious consideration, I resolved to tell him of it first. And it was not long before I had an opportunity, for the very next day his brother went to London upon some business, and the family being out a-visiting, just as it had happened before, and as indeed was often the case, he came according to his custom to spend an hour or two with Mrs. Betty. When he came, he had sat down a while. He easily perceived there to be an alteration in my countenance, that I was not so free and pleasant with him as I used to be, and particularly that I had been a-crying. He was not long before he took notice of it, and asked me in very kind terms what was the matter, and if anything troubled me. I would have put it off, if I could, but it was not to be concealed. So after suffering many importunities to draw that out of me which I longed as much as possible to disclose, I told him that it was true, something did trouble me, and something of such a nature that I could not conceal from him, and yet that I could not tell how to tell him of it neither, that it was a thing that not only surprised me, but greatly perplexed me, and that I knew not what course to take, unless he would direct me. He told me with great tenderness, that let it be what it would, I should not let it trouble me, for he would protect me from all the world. I then began at a distance, and told him I was afraid the ladies had got some secret information of our correspondence, for that it was easy to see that their conduct was very much changed towards me for a great while, and that now it was come to that pass that they frequently found fault with me, and sometimes fell quite out with me, though I never gave them the least occasion, that whereas I used always to lie with the eldest sister, I was lately put to lie by myself, or with one of the maids, and that I had overheard them several times talking very unkindly about me. But that which confirmed it all was that one of the servants had told me that she had heard I was to be turned out, and that it was not safe for the family that I should be any longer in the house. He smiled when he heard all this, and I asked him how he could make so light of it, that he must needs know that if there was any discovery I was undone for ever, and that even it would hurt him, though not ruin him as it would me. I upbraided him that he was like all the rest of the sex, that when they had the character and honor of a woman at their mercy, oftentimes made it their jest, and at least looked upon it as a trifle, and counted the ruin of those they had had their will of as a thing of no value. He saw me warm and serious, and changed his style immediately. He told me he was sorry that I should have such thought of him, that he had never given me the least occasion for it, but had been as tender of my reputation as he could be of his own, that he was sure our correspondence had been managed with so much address, that not one creature in the family had so much as a suspicion of it, that if he smiled when I told him my thoughts, it was at the assurance he lately received, that our understanding of one another was not so much as known or guessed at, and that when he had told me how much reason he had to be easy, I should smile as he did, for he was very certain it would give me a full satisfaction. "This is a mystery I cannot understand," says I, "or how it should be to my satisfaction that I am to be turned out of doors. For if our correspondence is not discovered, I know not what else I have done to change the countenances of the whole family to me, or to have them treat me as they do now, who formerly used me with so much tenderness, as if I had been one of their own children." "Why, look you, child," says he, "that they are uneasy about you, that is true, but that they have the least suspicion of the case as it respects you and I, is so far from being true that they suspect my brother Robin, and in short, they are fully persuaded he makes love to you. Nay, the fool has put it into their heads too himself, for he is continually bantering them about, and making a jest of himself. I confess I think he is wrong to do so, because he cannot but see it vexes them, and makes them unkind to you. But 'tis a satisfaction to me, because of the assurance it gives me that they do not suspect me in the least, and I hope this will be to your satisfaction too." "So it is," says I, "one way, but this does not reach my case at all, nor is this the chief thing that troubles me, though I have been concerned about that too." "What is it then?" says he. With which I fell to tears, and could say nothing to him at all. He strove to pacify me all he could, but began at last to be very pressing upon me to tell what it was. At last I answered that I thought I ought to tell him too, and that he had some right to know it. Besides, that I wanted his direction in the case, for I was in such perplexity that I knew not what course to take. And then I related the whole affair to him. I told him how imprudently his brother had managed himself, in making himself so public, and that if he had kept it a secret, as such a thing ought to have been, I could but have denied him positively, without giving any reason for it, and he would in time have ceased his solicitations. But that he had the vanity first to depend upon it that I would not deny him, and then had taken the freedom to tell his resolution of having me to the whole house. I told him how far I had resisted him, and told him how sincere and honourable his offers were. "But," says I, "my case will be doubly hard, for as they carry it ill to me now, because he desires to have me, they'll carry it worse when they shall find I have denied him, and they will presently say, 'There's something else in it,' and then out it comes that I am married already to somebody else, or that I would never refuse a match so much above me as this was." This discourse surprised him indeed very much. He told me that it was a critical point indeed for me to manage, and he did not see which way I should get out of it. But he would consider it, and let me know next time we met what resolution he was come to about it, and in the meantime desired I would not give my consent to his brother, nor yet give him a flat denial, but that I would hold him in suspense a while. I seemed to start at saying I should not give him my consent. I told him he knew very well I had no consent to give, that he had engaged himself to marry me, and that my consent was the same time engaged to him, that he had all along told me I was his wife, and I looked upon myself as effectually so as if the ceremony had passed, and that it was from his own mouth that I did so, he having all along persuaded me to call myself his wife. "Well, my dear," says he, "don't be concerned at that now. If I am not your husband, I'll be as good as your husband to you. And do not let those things trouble you now, but let me look a little farther into this affair, and I shall be able to say more next time we meet." He pacified me as well as he could with this, but I found he was very thoughtful, and that though he was very kind to me, and kissed me 1,000 times, and more, I believe, and gave me money too, yet he offered no more all the while we were together, which was above 2 hours, and which I much wondered at indeed at the time, considering how it used to be, and what opportunity we had. His brother did not come from London for 5 or 6 days, and it was 2 days more before he got an opportunity to talk with him. But then, getting him by himself, he began to talk very close to him about it, and the same evening got an opportunity, for we had a long conference together, to repeat all their discourse to me, which, as near as I can remember, was to the purpose following. He told him he heard strange news of him since he went, viz., that he made love to Mrs. Betty. "Well," says his brother a little angrily, "and so I do. And what then? What has anybody to do with that?" "Nay," says his brother, "don't be angry, Robin. I don't pretend to have anything to do with it, nor do I pretend to be angry with you about it. But I find they do concern themselves about it, and that they have used the poor girl ill about it, which I should take as done to myself." "Whom do you mean, they?" says Robin. "I mean my mother and the girls," says the elder brother. "But hark ye," says his brother, "are you in earnest? Do you really love this girl? You may be free with me, you know." "Why then," says Robin, "I will be free with you. I do love her above all the women in the world, and I will have her, let them say and do what they will. I believe the girl will not deny me." It struck me to the heart when he told me this, for though it was most rational to think I would not deny him, yet I knew in my own conscience I must deny him, and I saw my ruin in my being obliged to do so, but I knew it was my business to talk otherwise then, so I interrupted him in his story thus. "Ay," said I, "does he think I cannot deny him? But he shall find I can deny him, for all that." "Well, my dear," says he, "but let me give you the whole story, as it went on between us, and then say what you will." Then he went on and told me that he replied thus: "But, brother, you know she has nothing, and you may have several ladies with good fortunes." "'Tis no matter for that," said Robin. "I love the girl, and I will never please my pocket in marrying, and not please my fancy." "And so, my dear," adds he, "there is no opposing him." "Yes, yes," says I. "You shall see I can oppose him. I have learnt to say no now, though I had not learnt it before. If the best lord in the land offered me marriage now, I could very cheerfully say no to him." "Well, but my dear," says he, "what can you say to him? You know, as you said when we talked of it before, he will ask you many questions about it, and all the house will wonder what the meaning of it should be." "Why," says I, smiling, "I can stop all their mouths at one clap by telling him, and them too, that I am married already to his elder brother." He smiled a little too at the word, but I could see it startled him, and he could not hide the disorder it put him into. However, he returned, "Why, though that may be true in some sense, yet I suppose you are but in jest when you talk of giving such an answer as that. It may not be convenient on many accounts." "No, no," says I pleasantly. I am not so fond of letting the secret come out without your consent." "But what, then, can you say to him, or to them," says he, "when they find you positive against a match, which would apparently be so much to your advantage?" "Why," says I, "why should I be at a loss? First of all, I am not obliged to give me any reason at all. On the other hand, I may tell them that I am married already, and stop there. And that will be a full stop, too, to him, for he can have no reason to ask one question after it." "Aye," says he, "but the whole house will tease you about that, even to father and mother, and if you deny them positively, they will be disobliged at you, and suspicious besides." "Why," says I, "what can I do? What would you have me do? I was in straight enough before, and as I told you, I was in perplexity before, and acquainted you with the circumstances, that I might have your advice." "My dear," says he, "I have been considering very much upon it, you may be sure. And though it is a piece of advice that has a great many mortifications in it to me, and may at first seem strange to you, yet, all things considered, I see no better way for you than to let him go on, and if you find him hearty and in earnest, marry him." I gave him a look full of horror at those words, and turning pale as death, was at the very point of sinking down out of the chair I sat in, when, giving a start, he said, "What's the matter with you? Where are you a-going?" and a great many such things, and with jogging, and called to me, fetched me a little to myself, though it was a good while before I fully recovered my senses, and was not able to speak for several minutes more. When I fully recovered, he began again. "My dear," says he, "what made you so surprised at what I said? I would have you consider seriously of it. You may see plainly how the family stand in this case, and they would be stark mad if it was my case, as it is my brother's, and for aught I see, it would be my ruin and yours too." "Aye," says I, still speaking angrily, "are all your protestations and vows to be shaken by the dislike of the family? Did I not always object that to you, and you made light thing of it, as what you were above, and would value, and it is come to this now?" said I. "Is this your faith and honour, your love, and the solidity of your promises?" he continued, perfectly calm, notwithstanding all my reproaches. And I was not sparing of them at all, but he replied at last, "My dear, I have not broken one promise with you yet. I did tell you I would marry you when I was come to my estate, but you see my father is a hale, healthy man, and may live these 30 years still, and not be older than several are round us in town, and you never proposed my marrying you sooner, because you knew it might be my ruin. And as to all the rest, I have not failed you in anything. You have wanted for nothing." I could not deny a word of this, and had nothing to say to it in general. "But why, then," says I, "can you persuade me to such a horrid step as leaving you, since you have not left me? Will you allow no affection, no love on my side, where there has been so much on your side? Have I made you no returns? Have I given no testimony of my sincerity and of my passion? Are the sacrifices I have made of honour and modesty to you no proof of my being tied to you in bonds too strong to be broken?" "But here, my dear," says he, "you may come into a safe station, and appear with both honour and splendour at once, and the remembrance of what we have done may be wrapped up in an eternal silence, as if it had never happened. You shall always have my respect, and my sincere affection. Only then it shall be honest and perfectly just to my brother. You shall be my dear sister, and now you are my dear—" And there he stopped. "Your dear whore," says I. "You would have said it if you had gone on, and you might as well have said it, but I understand you. However, I desire you to remember the long discourses you have had with me, and the many hours' pains you have taken to persuade me to believe myself an honest woman. that I was your wife intentionally, though not in the eyes of the world, and that it was an effectual marriage that had passed between us, as is we had been publicly wedded by the parson of the parish. You know and cannot but remember that these have been your own words to me. I found this was a little too close upon him, but I made it up in what follows. He stood stock still for a while and said nothing, and I went on thus. You cannot, says I, without the highest injustice, believe that I yielded upon all these persuasions, without a love not to be questioned, not to be shaken again by anything that could happen afterward. If you have such dishonorable thoughts of me, I must ask you, what foundation in any of my behavior have I given for such a suggestion? If, then, I have yielded to the importunities of my affection, and if I have been persuaded to believe that I am really, and in the essence of the thing, your wife, shall I now give the lie to all those arguments and call myself your whore, or mistress, which is the same thing? And will you transfer me to your brother? Can you transfer my affection? Can you bid me cease loving you, and bid me love him? Is it in my power, think you, to make such a change at demand? No, sir, said I. Depend upon it, 'tis impossible, and whatever the change of your side may be, I will ever be true. And I had much rather, since it has come to that unhappy length, be your whore than your brother's wife. He appeared pleased and touched with the impression of this last discourse, and told me that he stood where he did before, that he had not been unfaithful to me in any one promise he had ever made yet, but that there were so many terrible things presented themselves to his view in the affair before me, and that on my account in particular, that he had thought of the other as a remedy so effectual as nothing could come up to it, that he thought this would not be entire parting us, but we might love as friends all our days, and perhaps with more satisfaction than we should in the station we were now in, as things might happen, that he durst say I could not apprehend anything from him as to betraying a secret, which could not but be the destruction of us both, if it came out, that he had but one question to ask of me that could lie in the way of it, and if that question was answered in the negative, he could not but still think it was the only step I could take. I guessed at his question presently, namely, whether I was sure I was not with child. As to that, I told him he need not be concerned about it, for I was not with child. Why then, my dear, says he, we have no time to talk further now. Consider of it, and think closely about it. I cannot be of the opinion still that it will be the best course you can take. And with this he took his leave, and the more hastily too, his mother and sisters ringing at the gate, just at the moment that he had risen up to go. He left me in the utmost confusion of thought, and he easily perceived it the next day, and all the rest of the week, for it was but Tuesday evening when we talked. But he had no opportunity to come at me all that week, till the Sunday after, when I, being indisposed, did not go to church, and he, making some excuse for the like, stayed at home. And now he had me an hour and a half again by myself, and we fell into the same arguments all over again, or at least so near the same, as it would be no purpose to repeat them. At last I asked him warmly, what opinion he must have of my modesty, that he could suppose I should so much as entertain a thought of lying with two brothers, and assured him it could never be. I added, if he was to tell me that he would never see me more, than which nothing but death could be more terrible, yet I could never entertain a thought so dishonorable to myself, and so base to him, and therefore I entreated him, if he had one grain of respect or affection left for me, that he would speak no more of it to me, or that he would pull his sword out and kill me. He appeared surprised at my obstinacy, as he called it, told me I was unkind to myself and unkind to him in it, that it was a crisis unlooked for upon us both, and impossible for either of us to foresee, but that he did not see any other way to save us both from ruin, and therefore he thought it the more unkind, but that if he must say no more of it to me, he added with an unusual coldness, that he did not know anything else we had to talk of. And so he rose up to take his leave. I rose up too, as if with the same indifference, but when he came to give me, as it were, a parting kiss, I burst out into such a passion of crying that though I would have spoke I could not, and only pressing his hand seemed to give him the adieu, but cried vehemently. He was sensibly moved with this, so he sat down again, and said a great many kind things to me, to abate the excess of my passion, but still urged the necessity of what he had proposed, all the while insisting that if I did refuse, he would notwithstanding provide for me, but letting me plainly see that he would decline me in the main point, nay, even as a mistress, making it a point of honor not to lie with the woman that for aught he knew might come to be his brother's wife. The bare loss of him as a gallant was not so much my affliction as the loss of his person, whom indeed I loved to distraction, and the loss of all the expectations I had, which I always had built my hopes upon, of having him one day for my husband. These things oppressed my mind so much, that in short I fell very ill. The agonies of my mind, in a word, threw me into a high fever, and long it was, that none in the family expected my life. End of section 4.
The LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gemma Blythe, Moll Flanders, by Daniel Defoe. Section 5. I was reduced very low indeed, and was often delirious and light-headed. But nothing lay so near me as the fear that, when I was light-headed, I should say something or other to his prejudice. I was distressed in my mind also to see him, and so he was to see me, for he really loved me most passionately, but it could not be. There was not the least room to desire it on one side or other, or so much as to make it decent. It was near 5 weeks that I kept my bed, and though the violence of my fever abated in 3 weeks, yet it several times returned, and the physicians said 2 or 3 times they could do no more for me, but that they must leave nature and the distemper to fight it out, only strengthening the first with cordials to maintain the struggle. After the end of 5 weeks I grew better, but was so weak, so altered, so melancholy, and recovered so slowly, that the physicians apprehended I should go into a consumption, and which vexed me most, they gave it as their opinion that my mind was oppressed, that something troubled me, and, in short, that I was in love. Upon this the whole house was set upon me to examine me, and to press me to tell whether I was in love or not, and with whom. But as I well might, I denied my being in love at all. They had on this occasion a squabble one day about me at table, that had like to have put the whole family in an uproar, and for some time did so. They happened to be all at table but the father. As for me, I was ill and in my chamber. At the beginning of the talk, which was just as they had finished their dinner, the old gentlewoman, who had sent me somewhat to eat, called her maid to go up and ask me if I would have any more. But the maid brought down word I had not eaten half what she had sent me already. "Alas," says the old lady, "that poor girl! I am afraid she will never be well." "Well," says the elder brother, "how should Mrs. Betty be well? They say she is in love." "I believe nothing of it," says the old gentlewoman. "I don't know," says the eldest sister, "what to say to it. They have made such a rout about her being so handsome and so charming, and I know not what, and that in her hearing too. That has turned the creature's head, I believe, and who knows what possessions may follow such doings? For my part, I don't know what to make of it." "Why, sister, you must acknowledge she is very handsome," says the elder brother. "Ah, and a great deal handsomer than you, sister," says Robin, "and that's your mortification." "Well, well, that is not the question," says his sister. "That girl is well enough, and she knows it well enough. She need not be told of it to make her vain." "We are not talking of her being vain," says the elder brother, "but of her being in love. It may be she is in love with herself. It seems my sisters think so." "I would she was in love with me," says Robin. "I'd quickly put her out of her pain." "What do you mean by that, son?" says the old lady. "How can you talk so?" "Why, madam," says Robin again, very honestly, "do you think I'd let the poor girl die for love, and of one that is near at hand to be had too?" "Fie, brother," says the second sister, "how can you talk so? Would you take a creature that has not a groat in the world?" "Prithee, child," says Robin, "beauty's a portion, and good humour with it is a double portion. I wish thou hadst half her stock of both for thy portion." For there was her mouth stopped. "I find," says the eldest sister, "if Betty is not in love, my brother is. I wonder he has not broke his mind to Betty. I warrant she won't say no." "They that yield when they're asked," says Robin, "are one step before them that were never asked to yield, sister, and two steps before them that yield before they are asked. And that's an answer for you, sister." This fired the sister, and she flew into a passion, and said things were come to that pass that it was time the wench, meaning me, was out of the family, and but that she was not fit to be turned out, she hoped her father and mother would consider of it as soon as she could be removed. Robin replied that was business for the master and mistress of the family, who were not to be taught by one that had so little judgment as his eldest sister. It ran up a great deal farther. The sister scolded, Robin rallied and bantered, but poor Betty lost ground by it extremely in the family. I heard of it, and I cried heartily, and the old lady came up to me, somebody having told her that I was so much concerned about it. I complained to her that it was very hard the doctor should pass such a censure upon me, for which they had no ground, and that it was still harder, considering the circumstances I was under in the family, that I hoped I had done nothing to lessen her esteem for me, or given any occasion for the bickering between her sons and daughters, and I had more need to think of a coffin than of being in love, and begged she would not let me suffer, in her opinion, for anybody's mistakes but my own. She was sensible of the justice of what I said, but told me, since there had been such a clamor among them, and that her younger son talked after such a rattling way as he did, she desired I would be so faithful to her as to answer her but one question sincerely. I told her I would, with all my heart, and with the utmost plainness and sincerity. Why, then, the question was, whether there was anything between her son Robert and me. I told her, with all the protestations of sincerity that I was able to make, and as I might well do, that there was not, nor ever had been. I told her that Mr. Robert had rattled and jested, as she knew it was his way, and that I took it always, as I supposed he meant it, to be a wild airy way of discourse that had no signification in it, and again assured her that there was not the least tittle of what she understood by it between us, and that those who had suggested it had done me a great deal of wrong, and Mr. Robert no service at all. The old lady was fully satisfied, and kissed me, spoke cheerfully to me, and bid me take care of my health and want for nothing, and so took her leave. But when she came down she found the brother and all his sisters together by the ears. They were angry even to passion at his upbraiding them with their being homely, and having never had any sweethearts, never having been asked the question, and their being so forward as almost to ask first. He rallied them upon the subject of Mrs. Betty. How pretty, how good-humored, how she sung better than they did, and danced better, and how much handsomer she was. And in doing this he omitted no ill-natured thing that could vex them, and indeed pushed too hard upon them. The old lady came down in the height of it, and to put a stop it to, told them all the discourse she had had with me, and how I answered that there was nothing between Mr. Robert and I. "She's wrong there," says Robin, "for if there was not a great deal between us, we should be closer together than we are." I told her I loved her hugely, says he, but I could never make the jade believe I was in earnest. "I do not know how you should," says his mother. "Nobody in their senses could believe you were in earnest, to talk so to a poor girl, whose circumstances you know so well. But prithee, son," adds she, "since you tell me that you could not make her believe you were in earnest, what must we believe about it? For you rambled so in your discourse, that nobody knows whether you are in earnest or in jest. But as I find the girl by your own confession has answered truly, I wish you would do so too, and tell me seriously, so that I may depend upon it. Is there anything in it, or no? Are you in earnest, or no? Are you distracted, indeed, or are you not? 'Tis a weighty question, and I wish you would make us easy about it. By my faith, madam, says Robin, 'tis in vain to mince the matter, or tell any more lies about it. I am in earnest, as much as a man is that's going to be hanged. If Mrs. Betty would say she loved me, and that she would marry me, I'd have her tomorrow morning fasting, and say to have and to hold, instead of eating my breakfast. Well, says the mother, then there's one son lost, and she said it in a very mournful tone, as one greatly concerned at it. I hope not, madam, says Robin. No man is lost when a good wife has found him. Why, but child, says the old lady, she is a beggar. Why then, madam, she has the more need of charity, says Robin. I'll take her off the hands of the parish, and she and I'll beg together. Ah, it's bad jesting with such things, says the mother. I don't jest, madam, says Robin. We'll come and beg your pardon, madam, and your blessing, madam, and my father's. This is all out of the way, son, says the mother. If you are in earnest, you are undone. I am afraid not, says he, for I am really afraid she won't have me. After all my sister's huffing and blustering, I believe I shall never be able to persuade her to it. That's a fine tale, indeed. She is not so far out of her senses, neither. Mrs. Betty is no fool, says the younger sister. Do you think she has learned to say no any more than other people? No, Mrs. Mirthwit, says Robin. Mrs. Betty's no fool. But Mrs. Betty may be engaged some other way, and what then? Nay, says the eldest sister, we can say nothing to that. Who must it be to, then? She is never out of the doors. It must be between you. I have nothing to say to that, says Robin. I have been examined enough. There's my brother. If it must be between us, go to work with him. This stung the elder brother to the quick, and he concluded that Robin had discovered something. However, he kept himself from appearing disturbed. Prithee, says he, don't go to shame your stories off upon me. I tell you, I deal in no such ware. I have nothing to say to Mrs. Betty, nor to any of the Mrs. Bettys in the parish. And with that he rose up and brushed off. No, says the eldest sister, I dare answer for my brother. He knows the world better. Thus the discourse ended, but it left the elder brother quite confounded. He concluded his brother had made a full discovery, and he began to doubt whether I had been concerned in it or not. But with all his management he could not bring it about to get at me. At last he was so perplexed that he was quite desperate, and resolved he would come into my chamber and see me, whatever came of it. In order to do this he contrived it so that one day after dinner, watching his eldest sister till he could see her go upstairs, he runs after her. Hark ye, sister, says he, where is this sick woman? May not a body see her? Yes, says the sister, I believe you may. But let me go first a little, and I'll tell you. So she ran up to the door and gave me notice, and presently called to him again. Brother, says she, you may come if you please. So in he came, just in the same kind of rant. Well, says he at the door as he came in, where is this sick body that's in love? How do you do, Mrs. Betty? I would have got up out of my chair, but was so weak I could not for a good while. And he saw it, and his sister too, and she said, Come, do not strive to stand up. My brother desires no ceremony, especially now you are so weak. No, no, Mrs. Betty, pray sit still, says he, and so sits himself down in a chair over against me, and appeared as if he were mighty merry. He talked a lot of rambling stuff to his sister and to me, sometimes of one thing, sometimes of another, on purpose to amuse his sister, and every now and then would turn it upon the old story, directing it to me. Poor Mrs. Betty, says he, it is a sad thing to be in love. Why, it has reduced you sadly. At last I spoke a little. I am glad to see you so merry, sir, says I, but I think the doctor might have found something better to do than to make his game at his patients. If I had been ill of no other distemper, I know the proverb too well to have let him come to me. What proverb? Says he. Oh, I remember it now. What? Where love is the case, the doctor's an ass. Is not that it, Mrs. Betty? I smiled and said nothing. "Nay," says he, "I think the effect has proved it to be love, for it seems the doctor has been able to do you but little service. You mend very slowly, they say. I doubt there's somewhat in it, Mrs. Betty. I doubt you are sick of the incurables, and that is love." I smiled and said, "No, indeed, sir, that's none of my distemper." We had a deal of such discourse, and sometimes others that signified as little. By and by he asked me to sing them a song, at which I smiled and said my singing days were over. At last he asked if he should play upon his flute to me. His sister said she believed it would hurt me, and that my head could not bear it. I bowed and said no, it would not hurt me. "And pray, madam," said I, "do not hinder it. I love the music of the flute very much." Then his sister said, "Well, do then, brother." With that he pulled out the key of his closet. "Dear sister," says he, "I am very lazy. Do step to my closet and fetch my flute. It lies in such a drawer," naming a place where he was sure it was not, that she might be a little while a looking for it. As soon as she was gone he related the whole story to me of the discourse his brother had about me, and of his pushing it at him, and his concern about it, which was the reason of his contriving this visit to me. I assured him I had never opened my mouth, either to his brother or to anybody else. I told him the dreadful exigence I was in, that my love to him and his offering to have me forget that affection and remove it to another had thrown me down, and that I had 1,000 times wished I might die rather than recover, and to have the same circumstances to struggle with as I had before, and that his backwardness to life had been the great reason of the slowness of my recovering. I added that I foresaw that as soon as I was well I must quit the family, and that as for marrying his brother, I abhorred the thoughts of it, after what had been my case with him, and that he might depend upon it I would never see his brother again upon that subject, that if he would break all his vows and oaths and engagements with me, be that between his conscience and his honor and himself, but he should never be able to say that I, whom he had persuaded to call myself his wife, and who had given him the liberty to use me as a wife, was not as faithful to him as a wife ought to be, whatever he might be to me. He was going to reply, and had said that he was sorry I could not be persuaded, and was going to say more, but he heard his sister a coming, and so did I, and yet I forced out these few words as a reply, that I could never be persuaded to love one brother and marry another. He shook his head and said, "Then I am ruined," meaning himself, and that moment his sister entered the room, and told him she could not find the flute. "Well," says he merrily, "this laziness won't do." So he gets up and goes himself to go to look for it, but comes back without it too, not but that he could have found it, but because his mind was a little disturbed, and he had no mind to play. And besides, the errand he sent his sister on was answered another way, for he only wanted an opportunity to speak to me, which he gained, though not much to his satisfaction. I had, however, a great deal of satisfaction in having spoken my mind to him with freedom, and with such an honest plainness as I have related, and though it did not at all work the way I desired, that is to say, to oblige the person to me the more, yet it took him from all possibility of quitting me but by a downright breach of honor, and giving up all the faith of a gentleman to me, which he had so often engaged by, never to abandon me, but to make me his wife as soon as he came to his estate. It was not many weeks after this before I was about the house again, and began to grow well, but I continued melancholy, silent, dull, and retired, which amazed the whole family, except he that knew the reason of it. Yet it was a great while before he took any notice of it, and I, as backward to speak as he, carried respectfully to him, but never offered to speak a word to him that was particular of any kind whatsoever. And this continued for 16 or 17 weeks, so that, as I expected every day to be dismissed the family, on account of what distaste they had taken another way, in which I had no guilt, so I expected to hear no more of this gentleman, after all his solemn vows and protestations, but to be ruined and abandoned. At last I broke the way myself in the family for my removing, for being talking seriously with the old lady one day about my own circumstances in the world, and how my distemper had left a heaviness upon my spirits, that I was not the same thing I was before. The old lady said, "I am afraid, Betty, what I have said to you about my son has had some influence upon you, and that you are melancholy on his account. Pray will you let me know how the matter stands with you both, if it may not be improper? For as for Robin, he does nothing but rally and banter when I speak of it to him." "Why, truly, madam," said I, "that matter stands as I wish it did not, and I shall be very sincere with you in it, whatever befalls me for it. Mr. Robert has several times proposed marriage to me, which is what I had no reason to expect, my poor circumstances considered. But I have always resisted him, and that perhaps in terms more positive than became me, considering the regard that I ought to have for every branch of your family. But," said I, "madam, I could never so far forget my obligation to you and all your house, to offer to consent to a thing which I know must needs be disobliging to you." And this I have made my argument to him, and have positively told him that I would never entertain a thought of that kind, unless I had your consent, and his father's also, to whom I was bound by so many invincible obligations. "And is this possible, Mrs. Betty?" says the old lady. "Then you have been much juster to us than we have been to you, for we have all looked upon you as a kind of snare to my son, and I had a proposal to make to you for your removing, for fear of it, but I had not yet mentioned it to you, because I thought you were not thorough well, and I was afraid of grieving you too much, lest it should throw you down again, for we have all the respect for you still, though not so much as to have it be the ruin of my son. But if it be as you say, we have all wronged you very much." "As to the truth of what I say, madam," said I, "refer you to your son himself. If he will do me any justice, he must tell you the story just as I have told it." Away goes the old lady to her daughters, and tells them the whole story just as I had told it her, and they were surprised at it, you may be sure, as I believe they would be. One said she could never have thought it, another said Robin was a fool, a third said she would not believe a word of it, and she would warrant that Robin would tell the story another way. But the old gentlewoman, who was resolved to go to the bottom of it before I could have the least opportunity of acquainting her son with what had passed, resolved too that she would talk with her son immediately, and to that purpose sent for him, for he was gone but to a lawyer's house in the town upon some petty business of his own, and upon her sending he returned immediately. Upon his coming up to them, for they were all still together, "Sit down, Robin," says the old lady, "I must have some talk with you." "With all my heart, madam," says Robin, looking very merry. "I hope it is about a good wife, for I am at a great loss in that affair." "How can that be?" says his mother. "Did not you say you resolved to have Mrs. Betty?" "Ay, madam," says Robin, "but there is one as forbid the banns." "Forbid the banns," says his mother. "Who can that be?" "Even Mrs. Betty herself," says Robin. "How so?" says his mother. "Have you asked her the question, then?" "Yes, indeed, madam," says Robin. "I have attacked her in form 5 times since she was sick, and I am beaten off. The jade is so stout she won't capitulate, nor yield upon any terms, except such as I cannot effectually grant." "Explain yourself," says the mother, "for I am surprised. I do not understand you. I hope you are not in earnest." "Why, madam," says he, "the case is plain enough upon me. It explains itself. She won't have me, she says. Is not that plain enough?" "I think 'tis plain, and pretty rough too." "Well, but," says the mother, "you talk of conditions that you cannot grant. What does she want? A settlement? Her jointure ought to be according to her fortune. But what fortune does she bring you?" "Nay, as to fortune," says Robin, "she is rich enough. I am satisfied in that point. But 'tis I that am not able to come up to her terms, and she is positive she will not have me without." Here the sisters put in. "Madam," says the second sister, 'Tis impossible to be serious with him. He will never give a direct answer to anything. You had better let him alone, and talk no more of it to him. You know how to dispose of her out of his way, if you thought there was anything in it." Robin was a little warmed with his sister's rudeness, but he was even with her, and yet with good manners too. "There are two sorts of people, madam," says he, turning to his mother, "that there is no contending with. That is, a wise body and a fool. 'Tis a little hard I should engage with both of them together." The younger sister then put in, "We must be fools indeed," says she, "in my brother's opinion, that he should think we can believe he has seriously asked Mrs. Betty to marry him, and that she has refused him." "Answer, and answer not, say Solomon," replied her brother. "When your brother had said to your mother that he had asked her no less than 5 times, and that it was so, that she positively denied him, methinks the younger sister need not question the truth of it when her mother did not. My mother, you see, did not understand it," says the second sister. "There's some difference," says Robin, "between desiring me to explain it and telling me she did not believe it." "Well, but son," says the old lady, "if you are disposed to let us into the mystery of it, what were these hard conditions?" "Yes, madam," says Robin, "I have done it before now, if the teasers here had not worried me by way of interruption. The conditions are, that I bring my father and you to consent to it, and without that, she protests she will never see me more upon that head. And to these conditions, as I said, I suppose I shall never be able to grant. I hope my warm sisters will be answered now, and blush a little. If not, I have no more to say till I hear further." This answer was surprising to them all, though less to the mother, because of what I had said to her. As to the daughters, they stood mute a great while, but the mother said with some passion, "Well, I had heard this before, but I could not believe it. But if it is so, then we have all done Betty wrong, and she had behaved better than I ever expected." "Nay," says the elder sister, "if it be so, she has acted handsomely indeed." "I confess," says the mother, "it was none of her fault, if he was fool enough to take a fancy to her. But to give such an answer to him shows more respect to your father and me than I can tell how to express. I shall value the girl the better for it as long as I know her." "But I shall not," says Robin, "unless you will give your consent." "I'll consider of that a while," says the mother. "I assure you, if there were not some other objections in the way, this conduct of hers would go a great way to bring me to consent." "I wish it would go quite through it," says Robin. "If you had as much thought about making me easy as you have about making me rich, you would soon consent to it." "Why, Robin," says the mother again, "are you really in earnest? Would you so fain have her as you pretend?" "Really, madam," says Robin, "I think 'tis hard you should question me upon that head, after all I have said. I won't say that I will have her. How can I resolve that point when you see I cannot have her without your consent? Besides, I am not bound to marry at all. But this I will say, I am in earnest in, that I will never have anybody else if I can help it. So you may determine for me, Betty or nobody in the world, and the question which of the two shall be in your breast to decide, madam, provided only that my good-humored sisters here may have no vote in it." All this was dreadful to me, for the mother began to yield, and Robin pressed her home on it. On the other hand, she advised with the eldest son, and he used all the arguments in the world to persuade her to consent, alleging his brother's passionate love for me and my generous regard to the family, in refusing my own advantages upon such a nice point of honor, and 1,000 such things. And as to the father, he was a man in a hurry of public affairs and getting money, seldom at home, thoughtful of the main chance, but left all those things to his wife. You may easily believe that when the plot was thus, as they thought, broke out, and that every one thought they knew how things were carried, it was not so difficult or so dangerous for the elder brother, whom nobody suspected of anything, to have a freer access to me than before. Nay, the mother, which was just as he wished, proposed it to him to talk with Mrs. Betty. "For it may be, son," said she, You may see farther into the thing than I, and see if you think she has been so positive as Robin says she has been, or no." This was as well as he could wish, and he, as it were, yielding to talk with me at his mother's request, she brought me to him into her own chamber, told me her son had some business with me at her request, and desired me to be very sincere with him, and then she left us together, and he went and shut the door after her. He came back to me and took me in his arms and kissed me very tenderly, but told me he had a long discourse to hold with me, and it was not come to that crisis, that I should make myself happy or miserable as long as I lived, that the thing was now gone so far, that if I could not comply with his desire, we would both be ruined. Then he told the whole story between Robin, as he called him, and his mother and sisters, and himself, as it is above. "And now, dear child," says he, "consider what it will be to marry a gentleman of a good family, in good circumstances, and with the consent of the whole house, and to enjoy all that the world can give you, and what, on the other hand, to be sunk into the dark circumstances of a woman that has lost her reputation, and that though I shall be a private friend to you while I live, yet as I shall be suspected always, so you will be afraid to see me, and I shall be afraid to own you." He gave me no time to reply, but went on with me thus: "What has happened between us, child, so long as we both agree to do so, may be buried and forgotten. I shall always be your sincere friend, without any inclination to nearer intimacy, when you become my sister, and we shall have all the honest part of conversation, without any reproaches between us of having done amiss. I beg of you to consider it, and to not stand in the way of your own safety and prosperity, and to satisfy you that I am sincere," added he, "I here offer you £500 in money, to make you some amends for the freedoms I have taken with you, which we shall look upon as some of the follies of our lives, which 'tis hoped we may repent of." He spoke this in so much more moving terms than it is possible for me to express, and with so much greater force of argument than I can repeat, that I only recommend it to those who read the story, to suppose that as he held me above an hour and a half in that discourse, so he answered all my objections, and fortified his discourse with all the arguments that human wit and art could devise. I cannot say, however, that anything he said made impression enough upon me so as to give me any thought of the matter, till he told me at last very plainly that if I refused, he was sorry to add that he could never go on with me in that station as we stood before, that though he loved me as well as ever, and that I was as agreeable to him as ever, yet sense of virtue had not so far forsaken him as to suffer him to lie with a woman that his brother courted to make his wife, and if he took his leave of me with a denial in this affair, whatever he might do for me in the point of support, grounded on his first engagement of maintaining me, yet he would not have me be surprised that he was obliged to tell me he could not allow himself to see me any more, and that indeed I could not expect it of him. I received this last part with some token of surprise and disorder, and had much ado to avoid sinking down, for indeed I loved him to an extravagance not easy to imagine. But he perceived my disorder. He entreated me to consider seriously of it, assured me that it was the only way to preserve our mutual affection, that in this station we might love as friends, with the utmost passion, and with the love of relation untainted, free from our just reproaches, and free from other people's suspicions, that he should ever acknowledge his happiness owing to me, that he would be debtor to me as long as he lived, and would be paying that debt as long as he had breath. Thus he wrought me up, in short, to a kind of hesitation in the matter, having the dangers on one side represented in lively figures, and indeed heightened by my imagination of being turned out to the wide world a mere cast-off whore, for it was no less, and perhaps exposed as such, with little to provide for myself, with no friend, no acquaintance in the whole world out of that town, and there I could not pretend to stay. All this terrified me to the last degree, and he took care upon all occasions to lay it home to me in the worst colours that it could be possible to be drawn in. On the other hand, he failed not to set forth the easy, prosperous life which I was going to live. He answered all that I could object from affection, and from former engagements, with telling me the necessity that was before us of taking other measures now, and as to his promises of marriage, the nature of things, he said, had put an end to that by the probability of my being his brother's wife before the time to which his promises all referred. Thus, in a word, I may say, he reasoned me out of my reason, he conquered all my arguments, and I began to see a danger that I was in, which I had not considered of before, and that was of being dropped by both of them and left alone in the world to shift for myself. This, and his persuasion, at length prevailed with me to consent, though with so much reluctance that it was easy to see I should go to church like a bear to the stake. I had some little apprehensions about me too, lest my new spouse, who, by the way, I had not the least affection for, should be skilful enough to challenge me on another account, upon our first coming to bed together. And whether he did it with design or not I know not, but his elder brother took care to make him very much fuddled before he went to bed, so that I had the satisfaction of a drunken bedfellow the first night. How he did it I know not, but I concluded that he certainly contrived it, that his brother might be able to make no judgment of the difference between a maid and a married woman, nor did he ever entertain any notions of it, or disturb his thoughts about it. I should go back a little here to where I left off. The elder brother having thus managed me, his next business was to manage his mother, and he never left till he had brought her to acquiesce and be passive in the thing, even without acquainting the father other than by post letters, so that she consented to our marrying privately, and leaving her to manage the father afterwards. Then he cajoled with his brother, and persuaded him what service he had done him, and how he had brought his mother to consent, which, though true, was not indeed done to serve him, but to serve himself. But thus diligently did he cheat him, and had the thanks of a faithful friend for shifting off his whore into his brother's arms for a wife. So certainly does interest banish all manner of affection, and so naturally do men give up honor and justice, humanity, and even Christianity, to secure themselves. I must now come back to brother Robin, as we always called him, who, having got his mother's consent, as above, came big with the news to me, and told me the whole story of it with a sincerity so visible that I must confess it grieved me that I must be the instrument to abuse so honest a gentleman. But there was no remedy. He would have me, and I was not obliged to tell him I was his brother's whore, though I had no other way to put him off. So I came gradually into it, to his satisfaction, and behold, we were married. Modesty forbids me to reveal the secrets of the marriage bed, but nothing could have happened more suitable to my circumstances than that, as above. My husband was so fuddled when he came to bed that he could not remember in the morning whether he had had any conversation with me or no, and I was obliged to tell him he had, though in reality he had not, that I might be sure he could make to inquiry about anything else. It concerns the story in hand very little to enter into the further particulars of the family, or of myself, for the 5 years that I lived with this husband, only to observe that I had 2 children by him, and that at the end of 5 years he died. He had been really a very good husband to me, and we lived very agreeably together, but as he had not received much from them, and had in the little time he lived acquired no great matters, so my circumstances were not great, nor was I much mended by the match. Indeed, I had preserved the elder brother's bonds to me, to pay 500 pounds, which he offered me for my consent to marry his brother, and this, with what I had saved of the money he formerly gave me, about as much more by my husband, left me a widow with about 1200 pounds in my pocket. My 2 children were, indeed, taken happily off my hands by my husband's father and mother, and that, by the way, was all they got by Mrs. Betty, I confess I was not suitably affected with the loss of my husband, nor indeed can I say that I ever loved him as I ought to have done, or was as proportionable to the good usage I had from him. For he was a tender, kind, good-humored man, as any woman could desire. But his brother being so always in my sight, at least while we were in the country, was a continual snare to me, and I never was in bed with my husband but I wished myself in the arms of his brother. And though his brother never offered me the least kindness that way after our marriage, but carried it just as a brother ought to do, yet it was impossible for me to do so to him. In short, I committed adultery and incest with him every day in my desires, which, without doubt, was as effectually criminal in the nature of the guilt as if I had actually done it. Before my husband died, his elder brother was married, and we, being then removed to London, were written to by the old lady to come and be at the wedding. My husband went, but I pretended indisposition, and that I could not possibly travel. So I stayed behind, for in short I could not bear the sight of his being given to another woman, though I knew I was never to have him myself. I was now, as above, left loose to the world, and being still young and handsome, as everybody said of me, and I assure you I thought myself so, and with a tolerable fortune in my pocket, I put no small value upon myself. I was courted by several very considerable tradesmen, and particularly very warmly by one, a linen draper, at whose house, after my husband's death, I took a lodging, his sister being my acquaintance. Here I had all the liberty and all the opportunity to be gay and appear in company that I could desire. My landlord's sister being one of the maddest, gayest things alive, and not so much mistress of her virtue as I thought at first she had been, she brought me into a world of wild company, and even brought home several persons, such as she liked well enough to gratify, to see her pretty widow, so she was pleased to call me, and that name I got in a little time in public. Now, as fame and fools make an assembly, I was here wonderfully caressed, had abundance of admirers, and such as called themselves lovers, but I found not one fair proposal among them. As for their common design, that I understood too well to be drawn into any more snares of that kind. The case was altered with me. I had money in my pocket, and had nothing to say to them. I had been tricked once by that cheat called love, but the game was over. I was resolved now to be married or nothing, and to be well married or not at all. End of section 5. Recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gemma Blythe. Moll Flanders by Daniel Defoe. Section 6. I loved the company, indeed, of men of mirth and wit, men of gallantry and figure, and was often entertained with such, as I was also with others. But I found by just observation that the brightest men came upon the dullest errand, that is to say, the dullest as to what I aimed at. On the other hand, those who came with the best proposals were the dullest and most disagreeable part of the world. I was not averse to a tradesman, but then I would have a tradesman, forsooth, that was something of a gentleman too, that when my husband had a mind to carry me to the court or to the play, he might become a sword, and look as like a gentleman as another man, and not be one that had the mark of his apron strings upon his coat, or the mark of his hat upon his periwig, that should look as if he was set on to his sword when his sword was put on to him, and that carried his trade in his countenance. Well, at last I found this amphibious creature, this land-water thing called a gentleman tradesman, and as a just plague upon my folly I was catched in the very snare which, as I might say, I laid for myself. I said for myself, for I was not trepanned, I confess, but I betrayed myself. This was a draper too, for though my comrade would have brought me to a bargain for a brother, Yet when it came to the point, it was, it seems, for a mistress, not a wife, and I kept true to this notion, that a woman should never be kept for a mistress that had money to keep herself. Thus my pride, not my principle, my money, not my virtue, kept me honest, though, as it proved, I found I had much better have been sold by my she comrade to her brother than have sold myself, as I did, to a tradesman that was rake, gentleman, shopkeeper, and beggar all together. But I was hurried on by my fancy to the gentleman, to ruin myself in the grossest manner that every woman did. For my new husband, coming to a lump of money at once, fell into such a profusion of expense, that all I had, and all he had before, if he had anything worth mentioning, would not have held it out above 1 year. He was very fond of me for about a quarter of a year, and what I got by that was, that I had the pleasure of seeing a great deal of my money spent upon myself, and, as I may say, had some of the spending it too. "Come, my dear," says he to me one day, "shall we go and take a turn into the country for about a week?" "Ah, my dear," says I, "whither would we go?" "I care not whither," says he, "but I have a mind to look like quality for a week." "We'll go to Oxford," says he. "How," says I, "shall we go? I am no horsewoman, and 'tis too far for a coach." "Too far," says he, "no place is too far for a coach and six. If I carry you out, you shall travel like a duchess." Says I, "my dear, 'tis a frolic, but if you have a mind to it, I don't care." Well, the time was appointed. We had a rich coach, very good horses, a coachman, postilion, and 2 footmen in very good liveries, a gentleman on horseback, and a page with a feather in his hat upon another horse. The servants all called him my lord, and the innkeepers, you may be sure, did the like, and I was her honor the countess. And thus we travelled to Oxford, and a very pleasant journey we had. For, give him his due, not a beggar alive knew better how to be a lord than my husband. We saw all the rarities at Oxford, talked with 2 or 3 fellows of college about putting out a young nephew that was left to his lordship's care, to the university, and of their being his tutors. We diverted ourselves with bantering several other poor scholars, with the hopes of being at least his lordship's chaplains and putting on a scarf. And thus, having lived like quality indeed, as to expense, we went away for Northampton, and, in a word, in about 12 days' ramble, came home again to the tune of about 93 pounds expense. Vanity is the perfection of a fop. My husband had this excellence, that he valued nothing of expense, and as his history, you may be sure, has very little weight in it, 'tis enough to tell you that in about 2 years and a quarter he broke, and was not so happy to get over into the Mint, but got into a sponging house, being arrested in an action too heavy from him to give bail to. So he sent for me to come to him. It was no surprise to me, for I had foreseen some time that all was going to wreck, and had been taking care to reserve something, if I could, though it was not much, for myself. But when he sent for me, he behaved much better than I expected, and told me plainly he had played the fool, and suffered himself to be surprised, which he might have prevented; that now he foresaw he could not stand it, and therefore he would have me go home, and in the night take away everything I had in the house of any value, and secure it. And after that he told me that if I could get away 100 or 200 pounds in goods out of the shop, I should do it. "Only," says he, "let me know nothing of it, neither what you take nor whither you carry it. For as for me," says he, "I am resolved to get out of this house and be gone, and if you never hear of me more, my dear," says he, "I wish you well. I am only sorry for the injury I have done you." He said some very handsome things to me indeed at parting, for I told you he was a gentleman, and that was all the benefit I had of his being so, that he used me very handsomely and with good manners upon all occasions, even to the last. Only spent all I had, and left me to rob the creditors for something to subsist on. However, I did as he bade me, that you may be sure, and having thus taken my leave of him, I never saw him more, for he found means to break out of the bailiff's house that night or the next and go over into France, and for the rest of the creditors scrambled for it as well as they could. How, I knew not, for I could come at no knowledge of anything more than this, that he came home about 3 o'clock in the morning, caused the rest of his goods to be removed into the mint, and the shop to be shut up, and having raised what money he could get together, he got over, as I said, to France, from whence I had 1 or 2 letters from him, and no more. I did not see him when he came home, for he having given me such instructions as above, and I having made the best of my time, I had no more business back home again at the house, not knowing but I might have been stopped there by the creditors, for a commission of bankrupt being soon after issued, they might have stopped me by orders from the commissioners. But my husband, having so dexterously got out of the bailiff's house by letting himself down in a most desperate manner from almost the top of the house to the top of another building, and leaping from thence, which was almost 2 stories, and which was enough indeed to have broken his neck, he came home and got away his goods before the creditors could come to seize, that is to say, before they could get out the commission and be ready to send their officers to take possession. My husband was so civil to me, for still I say he was much of a gentleman, that in the first letter he wrote me from France he let me know where he had pawned 20 pieces of fine Holland for £30, which were really worth £90, and enclosed me the token and an order for the taking them up, paying the money, which I did, and made in time above £100 of them, having leisure to cut them and sell them, some and some, to private families, as opportunity offered. However, with all this and all that I had secured before, I found, upon casting things up, my case was very much altered, and my fortune much lessened, for, including the Hollands and a parcel of fine muslins, which I carried off before, and some plate and other things, I found I could hardly muster up £500, and my condition was very odd, for though I had no child, I had had one by a gentleman draper, but it was buried, yet I was a widow bewitched. I had a husband and no husband, and I could not pretend to marry again, though I knew well enough my husband would never see England any more if he lived 50 years. Thus, I say, I was limited from marriage, what offer might soever be made me, and I had not one friend to advise with in the condition I was in, least not one I durst trust the secret of my circumstances to, for if the commissioners were to have been informed where I was, I should have been fetched up and examined upon oath, and all I have saved be taken away from me. Upon these apprehensions, the first thing I did was to go quite out of my knowledge and go by another name. This I did effectually, for I went into the mint too, took lodgings in a very private place, and called myself Mrs. Flanders. Here, however, I concealed myself, and though my new acquaintances knew nothing of me, yet I soon got a great deal of company about me, and whether it be that women are scarce among the sorts of people that generally are to be found there, or that some consolations in their miseries of the place are more requisite than on other occasions, I soon found an agreeable woman was exceedingly valuable among the sons of affliction there, and that those that wanted money to pay half a crown on the pound to their creditors, and that run in debt at the sign of the Bull for their dinners, would yet find money for a supper if they liked the woman. However, I kept myself safe yet, though I began like my Lord Rochester's mistress, that loved his company but would not admit him farther, to have the scandal of a whore, without the joy, and upon this score, tired with the place, and indeed with the company too, I began to think of removing. It was indeed a subject of strange reflection to me to see men who are overwhelmed in perplexed circumstances, who are reduced some degrees below being ruined, whose families were objects of their own terror and other people's charity, yet, while a penny lasted, nay, even beyond it, endeavoring to drown themselves, laboring to forget former things, which now it was the proper time to remember, making more work for repentance, and sinning on as a remedy for sin past. But it is none of my talent to preach. These men were too wicked even for me. There was something horrid and absurd in their way of sinning, for it was all a force even upon themselves. They did not only act against conscience, but against nature. They put a rape upon their temper to drown the reflections which their circumstances continually gave them. And nothing was more easy than to see how sighs would interrupt their songs, and paleness and anguish sit upon their brows, in spite of the forced smiles they put on. Nay, sometimes it would break out at their very mouths when they had parted with their money for a lewd treat or a wicked embrace. I have heard them, turning about, fetch a deep sigh and cry, "What a dog I am! Well, Betty, my dear, I'll drink thy health, though," meaning the honest wife, that perhaps had not a half-crown for herself and 3 or 4 children. The next morning they are at their penitentials again, and perhaps the poor weeping wife comes over to him, either brings him some account of what his creditors are doing, or how she and the children are turned out of doors, or some other dreadful news, and this adds to his self-reproaches. But when he has thought and pored on it till he is almost mad, having no principles to support him, nothing within him or above him to comfort him, but finding it all darkness on every side, he flies to the same relief again, to drink it away, debauch it away, and falling into company of men in just the same condition with himself, he repeats the crime, and thus he goes every day, one step onward of his way to destruction. I was not wicked enough for such fellows as these yet. On the contrary, I began to consider here very seriously what I had to do, how things stood with me, and what course I ought to take. I knew I had no friends, no, not one friend or relation in the world, and that little I had left apparently wasted, which, when it was gone, I saw nothing but misery and starving was before me. Upon these considerations, I say, and filled with horror at the place I was in and the dreadful objects which I had always before me, I resolved to be gone. I had made an acquaintance with a very sober, good sort of a woman, who was a widow too, like me, but in better circumstances. Her husband had been a captain of a merchant ship, and having had the misfortune to be cast away coming home on a voyage from the West Indies, which would have been very profitable if he had come safe, was so reduced by the loss that though he had saved his life then, it broke his heart, and killed him afterwards, and his widow, being pursued by the creditors, was forced to take shelter in the Mint. She soon made things up with the help of friends, and was at liberty again, and finding that I rather was there to be concealed than by any particular prosecutions, and finding also that I agreed with her, or rather she with me, in a just abhorrence of the place and of the company, she invited me to go home with her till I could put myself in some posture of settling in the world to my mind, withal telling me that it was 10 to 1 but some good captain of a ship might take a fancy to me and court me in that part of the town where she lived. I accepted her offer, and was with her half a year, and should have been longer, but in that interval what she proposed to me happened to herself, and she married very much to her advantage. But whose fortune soever was upon the increase, mine seemed to be upon the wane, and I found nothing present except 2 or 3 boatswain or such fellows. As for the commanders, they were generally of 2 sorts. One, such as, having good business, that is to say, a good ship, resolved not to marry but with advantage, that is, with a good fortune. 2, such as, being out of employ, wanted a wife to help them to a ship, I mean a wife who, having some money, could enable them to hold, as they call it, a good part of a ship themselves, so to encourage owners to come in; or a wife who, if she had not money, had friends who were concerned in shipping, and so could help to put the young man into a good ship, which to them is as good as a portion, and neither of these was my case, so I looked like one that was to lie on hand. This knowledge I soon learned by experience, that the state of things was altered as to matrimony, and that I was not to expect at London what I had found in the country; that marriages were here the consequences of politic schemes for forming interests and carrying on business, and that love had no share, or but very little, in the matter; that, as my sister-in-law in Colchester had said, beauty, wit, manners, sense, good humor, good behavior, education, virtue, piety, or any other qualification, whether of body or mind, had no power to recommend; that money only made a woman agreeable; that men chose mistresses indeed by the gust of their affection, and it was requisite to a whore to be handsome, well shaped, have a good mien, and a graceful behavior; but that for a wife no deformity would shock the fancy, no ill qualities the judgment. The money was the thing. The portion was neither crooked nor monstrous, but the money was always agreeable, whatever the wife was. On the other hand, as the market ran very unhappily on the men's side, I found the woman had lost the privilege of saying no; that it was a favor now for a woman to have the question asked, and if any young lady had so much arrogance as to counterfeit a negative, she never had the opportunity given her denying twice, much less of recovering that false step, and accepting what she had but seemed to decline. The men had such choice everywhere, that the case of the women was very unhappy, for they seemed to ply at every door, and if the man was by great chance refused at one house, he was sure to be received at the next. Besides this, I observed that the men made no scruple to set themselves out, and to go a fortune-hunting, as they called it, when they really had no fortune themselves to demand it, or merit to deserve it, and that they carried it so high that a woman was scarce allowed to inquire after the character or estate of the person that pretended to her. This I had an example of in a young lady in the next house to me, and with whom I had contracted an intimacy. She was courted by a young captain, and though she had near £2,000 to her fortune, she did but inquire of some of his neighbors about his character, his morals, or substance; and he took occasion at the next visit to let her know truly that he took it very ill, and that he should not give her the trouble of his visits any more. I heard of it, and I had begun my acquaintance with her. I went to see her upon it. She entered into a close conversation with me about it, and unbosomed herself very freely. I perceived presently that though she thought herself very ill-used, yet she had no power to resent it, and was exceedingly piqued that she had lost him, and particularly that another of less fortune had gained him. I fortified her mind against such meanness, as I called it. I told her that as low as I was in the world, I would have despised a man that should think I ought to take him upon his own recommendation only, without having the liberty to inform myself of his fortune or of his character. Also I told her that as she had a good fortune, she had no need to stoop to the disaster of the time; that it was enough that the men could insult us that had but little money to recommend us, but if she suffered such an affront to pass upon her without resenting it, she would be rendered low-prized upon all occasions, and would be the contempt of all the women in that part of the town; that a woman can never want an opportunity to be revenged of a man that has used her ill, and that there were ways enough to humble such a fellow as that, or else certainly women were the most unhappy creatures in the world. I found that she was very well pleased with the discourse, and she told me seriously that she would be very glad to make him sensible of her just resentment, and either to bring him on again or have the satisfaction of her revenge being as public as possible. I told her that if she would take my advice, I would tell her how she should obtain her wishes in both those things, and that I would bring the man to her door again and make him beg to be let in. She smiled at that, and soon let me see that if he came to her door, her resentment was not so great as to give her leave to let him stand long there. However, she listened very willingly to my offer of advice. So I told her that the first thing she ought to do was a piece of justice to herself, namely, that whereas she had been told by several people that he had reported among the ladies that he had left her, and pretended to give the advantage of the negative to himself, she should take care to have it well spread among the women, which she could not fail of an opportunity to do in a neighborhood so addicted to family news as that she lived in, that she had inquired into his circumstances, and found he was not the man as to estate he pretended to be. "Let them be told, madam," said I, "that you had been well informed that he was not the man that you expected, and that you thought it was not safe to meddle with him, that you heard he was of an ill temper, and that he boasted how he had used the women ill upon many occasions, and that particularly he was debauched in his morals, etc. The last of which, indeed, had some truth in it, but at the same time I did not find that she seemed to like him much the worse for that part." As I had put this into her head, she came most readily into it. Immediately she went to work to find instruments, and she had very little difficulty in the search, for telling her story in general to a couple of gossips in the neighborhood, it was the chat of the tea-table all over that part of the town, and I met with it wherever I visited. Also, as it was known that I was acquainted with the young lady herself, my opinion was asked very often, and I confirmed it with all the necessary aggravations, and set out his character in the blackest colors. And then, as a piece of secret intelligence, I added, as what the other gossips knew nothing of, that I had learned he was in very bad circumstances, that he was under a necessity of a fortune to support his interest with the owners of the ship he commanded, that his own part was not paid for, and if it was not paid quickly, his owners would put him out of the ship, and his chief mate was likely to command it, who offered to buy that part which the captain had promised to take. I added, for I confess I was heartily piqued at the rogue, as I called him, that I had heard a rumor too that he had a wife alive at Plymouth, and another in the West Indies, a thing which they all knew was not very uncommon for such kind of gentlemen. This worked as we both desired it, for presently the young lady next door, who had a father and mother that governed both her and her fortune, was shut up, and her father forbid him the house. Also, in one place more where he went, the woman had the courage, however strange it was, to say no, and he could try nowhere but he was reproached with his pride, and that he pretended not to give the women leave to inquire into his character, and the like. Well, by this time he began to be sensible of his mistake, and having alarmed all the women on that side of the water, he went over to Ratcliffe, and got access to some of the ladies there. But though the young women there, too, were, according to the fate of the day, pretty willing to be asked, yet such was his ill luck that his character followed him over the water, and his good name was much the same there as it was on our side. So that though he might have had wives enough, yet it did not happen among the women that had good fortunes, which was what he wanted. But this was not all. She very ingeniously managed another thing herself, for she got a young gentleman, who as a relation, and was indeed a married man, to come and visit her 2 or 3 times a week, in a very fine chariot and good liveries, and her 2 agents, and I also, presently spread a report all over that this gentleman came to court her. that he was a gentleman of £1,000 a year, and that he had fallen in love with her, and that she was going to her aunt's in the city, because it was inconvenient for the gentleman to come to her with his coach and redriff, the streets being so narrow and difficult. This took immediately. The captain was laughed at in all companies, and was ready to hang himself. He tried all the ways possible to come at her again, and wrote the most passionate letters to her in the world, excusing his former rashness, and, in short, by great application, obtained leave to wait on her again, as he said, to clear his reputation. At this meeting she had her full revenge of him, for she told him she wondered what he took her to be, that she should admit any man to a treaty of so much consequence as that to marriage, without inquiring very well into his circumstances, that if he thought she was to be huffed into wedlock, and that she was in the same circumstances which her neighbours might be in, to take up with the first good Christian that came, he was mistaken; that, in a word, his character was really bad, or he was very ill beholden to his neighbours, and that unless he could clear up some points in which she had justly been prejudiced, she had no more to say to him but to do herself justice and give him the satisfaction of knowing that she was not afraid to say no either to him or any man else. With that she told him what she had heard, or rather raised herself by my means, of his character, his not having paid for the part he pretended to own of the ship he commanded, of the resolution of his owners to put him out of the command, and to put his mate in his stead, and of the scandal raised on his morals, his having been reproached with such and such women, and having a wife at Plymouth and in the West Indies, and the like. And she asked him whether he could deny that she had good reason, if these things were not cleared up, to refuse him, and in the meantime to insist upon having satisfaction in points too significant as they were. He was so confounded at her discourse that he could not answer a word, and she almost began to believe that all was true by his disorder, though at the same time she knew that she had been the raiser of all these reports herself. After some time he recovered himself a little, and from that time became the most humble, the most modest, and most importunate man alive in his courtship. She carried her jest on a great way. She asked him if he thought she was so at her last shift, that she could or ought to bear such treatment, and if he did not see that she did not want those who thought it worth their while to come farther to her than he did, meaning the gentleman whom she had brought to visit her by way of sham. She brought him by these tricks to submit to all possible measures to satisfy her, as well of his circumstances as of his behavior. He brought her undeniable evidence of his having paid for his part of the ship. He brought her certificates from his owners that the report of their intending to remove him from the command of the ship and put his chief mate in was false and groundless. In short, he was quite the reverse of what he was before. Thus I convinced her that if the men made their advantage of our sex in the affair of marriage, upon the supposition of there being such choice to be had, and of the women being so easy, it was only owing to this, that the women wanted courage to maintain their ground and to play their part, and that, according to my Lord Rochester, a woman's ne'er so ruined that she can revenge herself on her undoer man. After these things, this young lady played her part so well, that though she resolved to have him, and that indeed having him was the main bent of her design, yet she made his obtaining her be to him the most difficult thing in the world, and this she did, not by a haughty reserved carriage, but by a just policy, turning the tables upon him, and playing back upon him his own game. For, as he pretended, by a kind of lofty carriage, to place himself above the occasion of a character, and to make inquiring into his character a kind of an affront to him, she broke with him upon that subject, and at the same time that she made him submit to all possible inquiry after his affairs, she apparently shut the door against his looking into her own. It was enough to him to obtain her for a wife. As to what she had, she told him plainly that as he knew her circumstances, it was but just that she should know his. And though at the same time he had only known her circumstances by common fame, yet he had made so many protestations of his passion for her that he could ask no more but her hand to his grand request, and the like ramble according to the custom of lovers. In short, he left himself no room to ask any more questions about her estate, and she took the advantage of it like a prudent woman, for she placed part of her fortune so in trustees, without letting him know anything of it, that it was quite out of his reach, and made him be very well content with the rest. It is true she was pretty well besides. That is to say, she had about £1,400 in money, which she gave him, and the other, after some time, she brought to light as a perquisite to herself, which he was to accept as a mighty favor, seeing though it was not to be his, it might ease him in the article of her particular expenses. And I must add that by this conduct the gentleman himself became not only the more humble in his applications to her to obtain her, but also was much the more an obliging husband to her when he had her. I cannot but remind the ladies here how much they place themselves below the common station of a wife, which, if I may be allowed not to be partial, is low enough already. I say they place themselves below their common station, and prepare their own mortifications by their submitting so to be insulted by the men beforehand, which I confess I see no necessity of. This relation may serve, therefore, to let the ladies see that the advantage is not so much on the other side as the men think it is. And though it may be true that the men have but too much choice among us, and that some women may be found who will dishonor themselves, be cheap, and easy to come at, and will scarce wait to be asked, yet, if they will have women, as I may say, worth having, they may find them as uncomfortable as ever, and that those that are otherwise are a sort of people that have such deficiencies when had as rather recommend the ladies that are difficult than encourage the men to go on with their easy courtship, and expect wives equally valuable that will come at first call. Nothing is more certain than that the ladies always gain of the men by keeping their ground, and letting their pretended lovers see they can resent being slighted, and that they are not afraid of saying no. They, I observe, insult us mightily with telling us of the number of women that the wars and the sea and trade and other incidents have carried the men so much away that there is no proportion between the numbers of the sexes, and therefore the women have the disadvantage. But I am far from granting that the number of women is so great, or the number of men so small. But if they will have me tell the truth, the disadvantage of the women is a terrible scandal upon the men, and it lies here, and here only, namely, that the age is so wicked, and the sex so debauched, that, in short, the number of such men as an honest woman ought to meddle with is small indeed, and it is but here and there that a man is to be found who is fit for a woman to venture upon. But the consequence even of that too amounts to no more than this, that women ought to be the more nice. For how do we know the just character of the man that makes the offer? To say that the woman should be the more easy on this occasion is to say we should be the forwarder to venture because of the greatness of the danger, which, in my way of reasoning, is very absurd. On the contrary, the women have 10,000 times the more reason to be wary and backward, by how much the hazard of being betrayed is the greater. And would the ladies consider this, and act the wary part, they would discover every cheat that offered. For, in short, the lives of very few men nowadays will bear a character, and if the ladies do but make a little inquiry, they will soon be able to distinguish the men and deliver themselves. As for women that do not think their own safety worth their thought, that, impatient of their perfect state, resolve, as they call it, to take the first good Christian that comes, that run into matrimony as a horse rushes into the battle, I can say nothing to them but this, that they are the sort of ladies that are to be prayed for among the rest of distempered people, and to me they look like people that venture their whole estates in a lottery where there's 100,000 blanks to one prize. No man of common sense will value a woman the less for not giving up herself at the first attack, or for accepting his proposal without inquiring into his person or character. On the contrary, he must think her the weakest of all creatures in the world, as the rate of men now goes. In short, he must have a very contemptible opinion of her capacities, nay, every of her understanding that, having but one case of her life, shall call that life away at once, and make matrimony, like death, be a leap into the dark. I would fain have the conduct of my sex a little regulated in this particular, which is the thing in which, of all the parts of life, I think at this time we suffer most in. 'Tis nothing but lack of courage, the fear of not being married at all, and of that frightful state of life called an old maid, of which I have a story to tell by itself. This, I say, is the woman's snare. But would the ladies once but get above that fear and manage rightly, they would more certainly avoid it by standing their ground. In a case so absolutely necessary to their felicity, that by exposing themselves as they do, and if they did not marry so soon as they may do otherwise, they would make themselves amends by marrying safer. She is always married too soon who gets a bad husband, and she is never married too late who gets a good one. In a word, there is no woman, deformity or lost reputation excepted, but if she manages well, may be married safely one time or other. But if she precipitates herself, it is 10,000 to 1, but she is undone. End of section 6. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain.